This is a diverse assembly gathered for this symposium. I'm pleased to say that two friends and colleagues from Brazil are with us. Professor Joachim Clotet, the president of the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul, is with us, and his colleague, Professor Thais Rosamano, old friends of mine, very pleased that they're here with us. We have people from various other places, as well as Oxford, and we have a participant from the University of British Columbia, our rescheduled speaker, Professor Chris Rea. And I was delighted when he consented to come from British Columbia to Oxford for this weekend, and in particular for this symposium, because he's an expert on two of, in addition to many other aspects of Chinese literature and culture, he's an expert on two of the most outstanding literary figures ever associated with Exeter College, who came here remarkably, Chinese people, a married couple in the 1930s. He'll tell us a lot about them in a moment, but a bit about our speaker before I turn him loose. Chris Rea was an undergraduate at Dartmouth College, having grown up in Berkeley, California, and he earned his MA, MPhil, and PhD degrees from Columbia University. He is Associate Professor in Modern Chinese Literature in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and he's produced a number of important works in Chinese literature and culture, including one with the wonderful subtitle of A New History of Laughter in China. He's also studied cultural entrepreneurs in China and Southeast Asia, and he's the editor of a book squarely on these two giants of Exeter's literary history. So without further ado, I'd like to call upon him to talk to us about those two great writers under the heading of The Power of Writing in and from the Margins. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Rick. I'd also like to thank Katrina and Amelia and members of the Development Office. It's really a remarkable honor to be able to speak today about two writers who I know well and love, one of whom is a graduate of Exeter, and his wife, Jiang, also accompanied him to Oxford, where they spent very happy 2 years that had a huge influence on their writing. So Qian Zhongshu and Yang are authors, they're scholars. As Rick mentioned, they're a married couple. And they're also two of modern China's most celebrated writers. They had been writing since the 1930s, but it was really in the 1980s when some new works were published and some of their old works were republished that they became famous for their writings. And around the same time, they also became famous for being recluses. And according to Yang, Qian Zhongshu once dissuaded a well-wisher and fan from visiting him by saying, "If you enjoyed eating an egg, would you really find it necessary to go find the hen that laid it?" So I think they were aware that fame can obscure things even as it amplifies others. In 1946, Qian Zhongshu wrote a story called Inspiration that features a main character known just as the writer, for the simple reason that the ring of his fame was too deafening for us to hear his name clearly. The name was obscured by the reputation, as it were. So Qian and Yang, I think, for the most part, did not seek the limelight. For much of their professional lives, they worked as literary researchers in an academic institute, and even their influence is questionable in some ways, since they had few students and they have no obvious stylistic inheritors. But I want to convince you today that their literary legacies are remarkable, even though since time is limited, I'm going to give them short shrift. But I thought I would emphasize letting you hear some of their words. So I'm not going to say too much about their reputation. If you're curious afterwards, we can talk a little bit more about the biography and how the views other people have of them. But I wanted to give a few examples from the writings to see what the power of the written word meant to them, and in particular focusing on a couple of motifs or themes that I think bear on the notion of the power of the written word, particularly the margin and the fragment. So Qian and Yang both claim that to be a writer is to be located on the margins of life, jotting down observations about it that are by nature piecemeal. But a fragment or an utterance can also have its own power. And they were keenly interested in the resonance of words as well as the ideas behind those words. And Qian, in some of his literary criticism, spoke about plucking off the flowers of words or imagery used by specific writers to get at the fruit of the shared idea beneath them. So I think the power of the written word for them really starts with reading to identify fragments of insight. On one day early in 1936, Qian Zhongshu sat down and began taking notes on Richard Whatley's 1908 book, Elements of Logic. The place was the Tower of Satiated Bookworms, or Baodulo, as he translated the name of the Bodleian Library. And the Bodleian's non-circulation policy is, I think, largely to credit, or partially to credit, for Qian's lifelong habit of transcribing book notes, right? Transcribing out striking passages, some of which he used in his later writings. But he actually arrived at Oxford already an insatiable bookworm himself. And, for example, there was a scholarship that funded his studies here, and in 3 years of competition, he received the highest mark for English literature. And in 1935, he was then 25 years old, he was already writing English language articles for Shanghai's Tianxia magazine. And he said, "I yield to none in my enthusiasm for our old literature." So Qian was aware that people might pilgrimage to a temple of learning for reasons besides the broadening of knowledge. And Fang Hongjian, the main character in his 1947 novel Fortress Besieged, this is probably the literary work for which Qian is best known. Fang Hongjian likened the rite of passage of coming to a place like Oxford to inoculation. Once we've studied abroad, we've gotten the inferiority complex out of our system. Our souls become strengthened, and when we do come across such germs as PhDs or MAs, we've built up a resistance against them. So by the time of his death in 1998, Qian's foreign language notes in English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Latin, and Greek consisted of 221 notebooks, mostly handwritten, some typed, totaling some 34,000 pages. He also left Chinese notes of about 15,000 pages. And most of these notebooks just transcribe the words of others. Only a few of them include his own comments and reflections. They were published only recently, and in some ways they're a reminder of unfulfilled potential, of books he wanted to write but didn't. But they also confirm that he really devoted his life to the written word through repeated readings and through the very humble labor of selecting and copying extracts from books. Yang Zhang accompanied Qian to Oxford and to the Bodleian. She was the first of the two to achieve literary fame in the 1940s for a series of comic plays. And she went on to a long and distinguished career as a fiction writer, a translator, an essayist, and a memoirist. So her literary career spanned over 8 decades. And she knew, I think based on some of that experience, that the power of the written word does ebb and flow over time. So for example, in her 1988 novel, Taking a Bath, and I'm showing some images of these to give you a sense of which of their works are available in English translation. This novel, Taking a Bath, which has been translated as a baptism, it's set in Beijing shortly after the founding of the People's Republic of China, so the success of the communists in 1949. And the place is a literary research institute whose faculty members are forced to undergo this Maoist thought reform campaign. And her narrator makes a comment once about, there's an old Chinese saying that you are how you write. Once people would judge you by your calligraphy, but in New China, the equivalent is public speaking. When you give a speech, those who listen decide what you are worth. But the idea that you are how you write actually shapes the mainstream view in China of Yang Zhang, right? That she has this very sparse, unadorned prose that reflects a modest and stoic personality. For Qian Zhongshu, the power of the written word was not measured by the pound. In that story, Inspiration, the writer dies, and his ghost saunters into his study, where there was such an incredible number of his works on the shelves that the ground could no longer carry their weight, and they break a hole in the crust of the earth, and the writer plunges headlong into the underworld, and his books all land on top of him. Quote, only then did he realize firsthand the impact of his works. So, Qian Qian is respected as a storyteller and for the careful structure of his novel, Fortress Besieged, unfortunately his only novel. But it is really the small units, right? The jokes, the similes, the wordplay, turns of phrase, and images that tend to stick in readers' minds. And reviewing his notebooks, in the third of them, he has an epigraph in which he seems to agree with the Scottish poet Alexander Smith that fine phrases I value more than banknotes. In a 1962 essay, he observes that the studies of pre-modern Chinese aesthetics have been dominated by a few famous treatises, which, in his judgment, is mostly empty pronouncement. In a separate work, he quotes Kierkegaard's quip that most systematizers are like a man who builds an enormous castle and lives in a shack close by. So Qian favored instead searching out what historians would call unintentional sources, on the theory that, in his words, a few short phrases jotted down carelessly often convey a refined and original insight that truly enhances understanding. Now, Qian anticipated the criticism that sordid and fragmentary utterances may well be a hodgepodge, and he even entitled one of his books of reading notes, Chop Suey. He had another nice way of describing it, which is that theoretical systems are like buildings that were once grand and imposing, but have subsequently fallen into ruin. But certain of the materials used to construct them, some timbers, stones, or tiles, might still be valuable or useful to later generations. And I find he seems to imply that all theories eventually fragment, but those fragments may yet be used to build something new. Yang Zhang's wit shines through in her stage plays such as Forging the Truth, her novel Taking a Bath, yet her dominant mode as a creative writer is as understated as her husband's is effervescent. Yang Zhang, to me, really excelled at the pregnant detail, the wry observation, and the lightly dropped bombshell. Her most famous work is 6 chapters of Life in the Cadre School, translated as 6 chapters from My Life Down Under. It's a memoir about her experience living in rural Henan province during the Cultural Revolution. In 1970, Qian and Yang, who were then in their 60s and were living in Beijing, had their work disrupted. They were sent to be re-educated by peasants and reformed through agricultural labor. So in the memoir, Yang and her adult daughter and her son-in-law go to see Qian Zhongshu off. He was the first to depart at the train station. Just a few pages later, it's Yang's turn to depart from the cadre school. There had been 3 of us to see Zhongshu off, A Yuan, De Yi, and myself. But this time A Yuan was there alone to see me off. De Yi had taken his own life a month earlier. In the cadre school, Yang works for months in a vegetable plot from which the locals keep stealing the produce. She helps to set up an outhouse, but the villagers steal the curtain that she and her co-worker had put up. And so they have to serve as each other's door when they use the bathroom. And even the contents of the toilet are stolen. For local wisdom had it that the waste produced by the intellectuals was the best around. When the cadre school moves, she and Qian Zhongshu go to take a last look at the vegetable plot. The shed was gone. The well platform was gone. The irrigation ditches were gone. The vegetable beds were gone. And even the small mound of earth of another suicide's grave had disappeared from sight. All that was left was a piece of empty land strewn with clods. So this return on the eve of departure to find all traces of one's work vanished is characteristic of Yang's existentialism, and students of Chinese history might well also read into this barren image a comment on the folly of the political movement that sent her and Qian to the countryside in the first place. On a stray leaf in Qian's foreign language notes, there appears a quotation that Yang Zhang typed in November 8th, 1936, while they were here at Oxford. We must sacrifice whole volumes to achieve a little piece of perfection that if it too were burnt, the ashes of it would not fill a doll's thimble. Fortunately, with the exception of some of Qian's memoirs, most of the writings were not burnt. From 1998, when Qian died, until Yang Zhang's own death this year, at the age of 104, she spent nearly 2 decades curating her late husband's literary legacy. She also wrote several works in which she publicly comes to terms with the leftover feeling that follows profound loss. These works include Phaedo, her retranslation from English of the Platonic dialogue, We Three, a book mixing fictional fantasy, memoir, and family scrapbook, and Arriving at the Margins of Life, Answering My Own Questions, a self-dialogue about the meaning of human existence, which considers the ideas of a range of philosophers as well as her own life experience. These two writers shared some sensibilities, but they're definitely not identical. I find that Qian was a lot more comfortable with the idea that existence is fragmentary inherently, but that Yang had a stronger desire for closure. And there are a couple examples that stand out in my mind. The title, 6 Chapters of Life in a Cadre School, was inspired by a Qing Dynasty work, 6 Chapters of a Floating Life, which is noted for its touching testimony to the quotidian delights of a marriage that was happy despite poverty. And Yang concludes her memoir with the assertion that the spirit of the individual defies political imposition. She writes, "I now understood something more clearly than ever. After undergoing more than 10 years of reform, plus 2 years at the cadre school, not only had I not reached the plateau of progressive thinking that everyone sought, I was nearly as selfish now as I had been in the beginning. I was still the same old me." So her ending emphasizes the stubborn presence. But Qian's forward to that same book points to an absence. He notes that Shen Fu's work actually only contains 4 extant chapters, while Yang's 6 chapters, in his opinion, should have included a 7th, a sense of shame, participating in political campaigns. And he implies that lack of historical reconciliation awaits redress by a motivated scholar. He says, "Who can say that the day will not come when the missing chapters of these 2 books will surface to fill in the gaps?" There's one other example I would give about this notion of closure versus comfort with leaving things open. Shortly before Yang's death, she authorized an anthology called The Complete Works of Yang Jiang. But in Qian's story Inspiration, the last works that dribble from the dying writer's lips are, "Don't collect my works into a series of complete works because... ... Witnesses later enthusiastically debate the meaning behind the writer's last words. Some said he had written so much it was simply impossible to make any collection a complete one. Others conjectured that since additional hundreds of thousands of novels, plays, and songs had been planned, what little there remained in print would hardly be representative. This controversy between the 2 schools grew to be the most intriguing chapter in the history of Chinese literature. So after Qian Zhongshu died, his collected works were called simply the Qian Zhongshu Collection. I don't know if anyone ever read Pierre Bayard's rather cheeky book, How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read? You've read it? I don't believe it. I have read it, and I recommend it to all my graduate students. But in that he offers 4 ways of not reading. And he divides the world of books into books you don't know, books you have skimmed, books you have heard of, and books you have forgotten, in which he includes most of his own works in that category. And I find reading Qian Zhongshu works, I get the feeling that all reading is fragmentary. So the question is then, as Adam raised, what do you do with the fragments? And I find that Qian's work testifies to a belief that the power of the written word is realized partly by the like-minded, by zhiyin, or those who know the tone. Words and ideas resonate in the minds of kindred spirits from different times and places. And 2 thinkers who may have no genealogical link, who follow the same train of thought, Qian described as being like carts made to match the same wheel ruts. These people cast knowing smiles at each other across the distance. I want to give a couple of examples from one of Qian's seminal works of criticism, Guanzhui Bian, or limited views. One is the question of whose words carry weight. Right? Does one have to be a good writer in order to be a good critic, for example? And he quotes many voices who would answer yes to this, including the 3rd century writer Cao Zhi, who put it, "You ought to have a sword as sharp as dragon pool before you discuss slicing and cutting." Or one that may be more familiar, Pope's, "Let such teach others who themselves excel, and censure freely who have written well." But in fact, Qian claims, this is like saying you must be a horse or a pig before you can be a good veterinarian. And the root of the problem to him is that no writer is comprehensively good, and that their particular individual stylistic strengths turn into critical blindsight or bias when it comes to evaluating other writers. And he says, one-sidedness of creative talent and one-sidedness of critical taste go hand in hand, go together like key and keyhole or lid and box. And so he offers as a counterpoint to Cao Zhi, Horace, who said of his preference to teach rather than practice poetic composition, "I am like the whetstone. It does not slice or cut by itself, but it sharpens other blades." Qian's views on metaphor are a little bit more elaborate. He wrote an essay called Metaphors Have Two Handles and Several Sides, which begins by proposing that a metaphor has two handles by which a critic or writer might wield it to praise or to censure. So one example is the moon reflected in water. Right? This appears in a lot of Buddhist texts to symbolize a truth that can be perceived but not grasped. And it stands for something that's lofty, supreme, or unapproachable. But the same metaphor might also mean illusory, deceptive, or superficial. He also gives examples dating back to the 3rd century BCE of the mirror and the scale as a symbol of impartiality. And Zhuge Liang says, he writes, "My mind is like a scale, which does not lose its equilibrium for any person." But on the other hand, Zhu Xi says, "The equilibrium of the mind is like that of a scale. As long as no object is placed on it, the scale remains level. But as soon as something is placed on it, the scale loses its equilibrium." And he also cites another 5th century writer who uses the same metaphor to deplore conditional friendship, speaking of scale friends or measuring friends who carry scales. To illustrate the multiple sides of metaphor, Qian returns to the moon, which might symbolize roundness, completeness, brightness, clarity, for example, clarity of vision, or inconstancy with its waxing and waning. He then brings the concepts of handles and sides together, saying, "The moon and the water is an image of universality, conveying the idea of a single underlying principle that pervades a myriad of different manifestations." And he notes that in poetry, while imagery and similes are needed to explore and analyze abstract thought, discriminating thinkers realize that words may do violence to ideas by obscuring or displacing them, and that the use of multiple similes to convey a single idea is a technique philosophers adopt in an attempt to prevent the reader from becoming fixated on a particular analogy and cling to it rather than to the idea. And so to break the grip of words, he uses a type of creative destruction, right, a kind of word cannibalism. So as a critic, he really focused on insight, of trying to strike connections by comparing such utterances, pulling them out of one context and putting them into a new one. So his work is very curatorial in some ways. It shows how these different ideas resonate through the ages and across languages. And so I think one implication is that writing is powerful because it leaves a type of trace to enable this sort of inquiry. And decades before he wrote Limited Views, in Fortress Besieged, he, I think, put this notion that a cascade of figurative language can help to enliven the mind into practice. So Fang Hongjian, this hapless protagonist, he arrives at an obscure university in China's interior during the war called Sanlu University. And he discovers he was going to teach philosophy, but he's been reassigned to teach logic, which is a subject that's unfamiliar to him. And Qian deploys multiple metaphors to help us appreciate Fang's predicament from more than one angle. So relying on a primer of logic that Fang Hongjian finds in the library, which I suspect, when preparing the speech, is perhaps that 1908 Elements of Logic that Qian read at Oxford, Fang discovers that lecturing is like trying to make clothes out of a piece of material that is not big enough. And once, just like a man given a laxative after going hungry for a few days, he couldn't squeeze anything out, no matter how hard he tried. And he just had to dismiss class a quarter of an hour earlier. So professors who ramble on are, by implication, full of it. Qian Zhongshu's first book was published in 1941, so after his time at Oxford. It's an essay collection, and Yang Jiang chose the title for it, Written in the Margins of Life. Qian wrote a preface to it, which I think is fascinating. He said, "Life, it has been said, is one big book. Should life indeed be so, most of us writers can only claim to be book critics, who need not read more than a few pages to turn out a pile of commentary and wrap up a book review in no time." But he said he himself prefers to browse at a leisurely pace, and as thoughts strike him, jot down in the margins a piecemeal, spontaneous impression. These impressions may not constitute the verdict on the entire book, and they may not even be consistent. His essays, he said, are written in the margins of the book of life, which still have plenty of blank space. In 2007, Yang Jiang published her penultimate standalone book, Arriving at the Margins of Life. So this motif of the margins bookends their literary careers in some ways, and it reflects their self-image as writers on the margins, as mortal human beings, as peripheral members of the literary establishment, and as people out of step with the politics of their time. In the early 1950s, Yang, along with Qian, experienced a Maoist political campaign that forced intellectuals to make public self-criticisms. And in her novel, Taking a Bath, Yang explores the effects of public exposure, but rejects the notion that morality should be determined by anyone besides the individual. She herself preferred the position of the dispassionate spectator, observing this type of herd behavior. So this very much put her at odds with the Maoist mainstream discourse, and with a conceit that I think has a lot of traction in China today, that the masses of the people are the ultimate arbiters of right and wrong. The notion of margins, it was not purely a passive process. Qian, I think, marginalized himself from the masses, and actually from a lot of his fellow writers, by writing limited views in a very difficult form of classical Chinese, like a deliberate type of archaic language. So he was deliberately limiting others' views of his work, partly out of self-protection. And he was writing during the Cultural Revolution at a time when you'd have these teenage Red Guards ransacking people's homes. Yang Jiang, for example, had completed a complete draft translation of Don Quixote. She had taught herself Spanish in the 1950s and translated Don Quixote, and her manuscript was confiscated. It was returned to her later, but the Red Guards who were doing this kind of home ransacking, their education had been interrupted, and so most of them did not know classical Chinese, so they could not read a work like Limited Views. So I take Qian's writing in classical Chinese partly as a protest against this prevailing hostility to China's cultural heritage. He was trying to say there's still one person in China who can write like this. Now, as then, Limited Views demands a type of multiliteracy in over half a dozen languages that few people possess. So I feel like everybody who reads it in fragments. And I want to return in closing to this notion of fragments and margins. Since we now live in an age of images, emoji displacing different types of language, TV talk, and so I think the power of the written word may seem to be on the wane. I'd also point out that there's never been a shortage of people who will talk down the written word. So the 4th century BCE commentary of Zuo, or Zuo Zhuan, a tremendously influential work, mentions 3 types of immortality that one might achieve through deeds, li gong, through virtue, li de, or through words, li yan. And I would just point out that achieving immortality through words, in this view, is last and least of those 3 things. But Qian and Yang were relatively modest in speaking themselves as reading the book of life, but then also expanding it by scribbling in its margins, right? It actually makes the book bigger. One section of Limited Views explores the notion that literary composition is often inspired by worldly frustration. And a classical example in China is Sima Qian, who wrote the Records of the Grand Historian after being castrated. In 1939, so he was still in his 20s, Qian mocked the common lament among writers that were compelled into their profession. He said, they resemble those young women of good family in old novels who become prostitutes, it is said, due to circumstances beyond their control and lack of any viable alternatives. He goes on to say, literature is a profession of ill fortune and gloomy spirits, but clearly for this pair of writers, it was also a choice and a pleasure. And in 1983, around the time that Qian and Yang were being rediscovered, a joint edition of 2 of Qian Zhongshu's early works was published. His essay collection, Written in the Margins of Life, and his story collection, Humans, Beasts, and Ghosts. And Qian's preface alludes to this larger post-Mao project of cultural rediscovery. He says, since archaeologists began promoting tomb excavation, the withered bones of countless ancient dead people and other artifacts have been uncovered. Since modern literature became its own specialized field of research, the soon-to-wither or already withered works of living writers have also been dug up and exposed. For some of us, our delight at having been dug up has caused us to overlook the danger of such exposure, since we don't realize that it is by leaving his works buried that the author preserves his undeserved reputation. Should the author himself take the lead in the excavation work, the loss might well outstrip the gains, and digging one's own grave will become a self-contradictory pun. To open the grave in which one's works are buried is also to dig one's authorial grave. So writers, I think Qian suggests here, should be wary of being conscripted as literary relic hunters. But that leaves a question, for reader and critic, is this book worth reading, right? Or what is this writing good for, would be another way to phrase it. And to return to Fang Hongjian, when he's in this obscure university in the provinces, desperately searching for course materials on logic, this search takes him to the Sanlu University Library, which I think of as kind of an anti-Bodleian library, because it holds fewer than 1,000 volumes, and most of these are worn-out works. And Qian's narrator comments, 1,000 years hence, these books would be as priceless as the manuscripts from the Dunhuang caves. Now they are ancient without being rare. All libraries, like the brains of a drudge at examination time, are graveyards of learning. This library, however, was like an old-fashioned charitable organization which cherished the written word. So Qian, who joked about digging one's authorial grave, spent most of his time in graveyards of learning, as he put it. And even before his death, some Chinese critics had adopted the habit of referring to Qian and Yang as old-style intellectuals, an epithet that mixes a kind of respect for their literary accomplishment with a type of latter-day condescension. And to some people in modern China, Qian's bookish habits and Yang's emphasis on the self-cultivation of the individual marked them as relics of a bygone age. But they also looked forward. Since 2001, Yang Zhang has donated royalties from her and Qian's books to endow a Philobiblon, or book lover scholarship to Tsinghua University, their alma mater. I still find that much of Qian Zhongshu's and Yang Zhang's writing speaks to me personally, and I'm not quite ready to accept this merely as a sign that I am getting old. Qian and Yang seem to have appreciated that even though obsolescence is the common fate of human beings, the written word leaves a trace that possesses a type of latent power. So current events may recede into history, and yet, like the moldy books of Sanlu University, those fragmented records that survive the erosion of time might eventually be unearthed and become the stuff of civilization.